got a really good ancient Greece joke. Let's see. Oh, come on, Mr. Bruce. Don't be a Socrates and tell us. Well, okay, I will. Why was Odysseus in such a rush to win the Trojan War? Because he wanted to get Homer. My apologies for that cheesy pun. All right, 6th grade. I have 11 study guide questions that we need to get through. So let's jump right into it. List each of the 4 social classes of the Greek city-states. Why did many members of the bottom 2 social classes not have any political power? Why did members of the highest social class have the most political power? Okay, so Greek social classes. This is from section 3. There's 4 social classes. Number 1, the aristocrats. They are on top. Why did the aristocrats have the most political power? Well, because they they were wealthy. They were wealthy. And they had large estates, right? So they owned a lot of slaves. This meant that they had a lot of free time to focus on politics. Right? So they were able to basically spend the most amount of time shaping the polis to fit their wants and their needs. The second social class, small farmers. The third social class, merchants and artisans. And then, of course, the bottom class are slaves. So merchants and artisans and slaves, as the bottom 2 social classes, did not have any political power. Why is this? Because they were not citizens of Greece, of the Greek city-states. So merchants and artisans were, for the most part, not citizens of the city-states because they were foreigners or metics. And then, of course, slaves weren't citizens because the way Greek society was set up, a slave would never be able to do something like vote or anything like that. So basically, in order to participate in Greek politics, you had to be a citizen, and you needed property. You usually had to own some sort of land. All right, why did the Greeks produce cheese, wine, olives, dates, and figs rather than wheat? Well, wheat requires a lot of arable land as well as significant irrigation or rainfall. As we know, Greece does not have arable land and has a very dry climate, so they didn't get a lot of rainfall. Also, there aren't really any major river systems going through Greece. So there's no like river valley you can plant wheat in. So if that's the case, well, why did they have so much cheese, wine, olives, dates, and figs? Well, wine comes from grapes. Wine, olives, dates, and figs grow on vines and on trees that do very well in a Mediterranean climate. Right? They grow on hillsides, on mountainsides. They don't need a whole lot of water. About cheese. Well, cheese in ancient Greece did not come from cattle for the most part, because cattle need a lot of open space for grazing, but it did come from goats. Right? Greece had a lot of goats, sheep, animals that are in herds that do really well in a Mediterranean climate because they can climb. Right? Goats are great climbers. Sheep do pretty well in a Mediterranean climate. Sheep can actually climb fairly well. Cows don't. So the cheese they got was like goat cheese for the most part. What kinds of Greek values did the Iliad and the Odyssey express? So I'll list them off. Courage, honor, family loyalty, cleverness, ambition, If you put like strength or bravery, that's fine too. They also express values about social roles of men and women, right? So Odysseus goes outside of the home to wage war, which is something that men are supposed to do. They're supposed to be outside of the home, whereas Penelope, his wife, stays inside of the home for 20 years, remaining loyal to him, taking care of his household, managing things. All right, number 4. How is the way the city-states were ruled different than the way Messenia, Troy, and Ionia were ruled? Well, Messenia, Troy, and Ionia were kingdoms, right? So in those kingdoms, these all existed before the city-states. Men and women of the royal family had pretty much all of the political power, and everyone else was their subject. In the city-states, most political power existed with the aristocrats. However, any citizen, any male citizen of the city-states could participate in government, so even poor farmers could participate in government as long as they were men. In the city-states, remember, women did not have any political power at all. It was just men. Describe the physical layout of a Greek city-state. So a Greek city-state has 2 levels. There's usually a hill or hills in the city-state. So at the top of the hill, you have the Acropolis, which is where all the most important buildings and meetings occur. And then you have a lower level where you have most of the homes, shops, public buildings that aren't as important. Right? And then if they had fields, farmland, those would be on the lower level too as well. All right. And city-states were also quite small. They needed to be small in order to function. So the actual land that a city-state possessed was pretty small. Okay. Why was ancient Greece never united under a single authority? Well, its geography made it very difficult for any city-state to acquire a whole lot of land or territory. It'd be really hard to move a conquering army over the rocky terrain. So Greece's rocky terrain kind of formed like natural barriers that protected the city-states from each other. The closest any city-state got to conquering all of Greece was Sparta. Sparta had a very powerful army at different points in its history, and it was able to temporarily conquer a lot of the surrounding Greek city-states, but it never was able to control all of Greece and unite it under its rule. Why did Greeks rely so heavily on the sea? Well, they pretty much had to, right? Like I said, Greece has very rocky terrain, not a whole lot of arable farmland. So in order to acquire like wheat that you need for bread and other resources, they had to engage in trade. And because they're on a peninsula, pretty much all the trade that they did was by sea. Also, it's really hard to travel from one part of Greece to another part of Greece on land. It was usually easier to travel by sea, even though the miles you sail are significantly greater than the miles you would have to walk over land. It's just that it's basically impossible to bring yourself over miles of rocky terrain. And then, of course, the sea also provided a lot of natural resources that the Greeks used to sustain themselves. So they ate a lot of seafood. They used other resources from the sea as well. Name 2 reasons that farmers had a higher social status than artisans and merchants. Number 1, artisans and merchants, for the most part, were foreigners. Farmers, for the most part, were not. So that's one reason. Number two, farmers owned land. Artisans and merchants typically did not. Right? So if you were a farmer, even if you were very poor and your neighbor was an artisan or a merchant and they were a lot wealthier than you still had a higher social status, because the Greeks believed that the fact that you own land and the fact that you were a farmer made you superior to the artisan and merchant, even though they were wealthier. Even if you weren't a farmer who owned land, even if you were a tenant farmer, still the mere fact that you produced food made you more important in Greek society than an artisan or merchant. I'm not sure I talked about this, but a Metic, I don't think I've talked about it in the study guide videos so far. A Metic is a Greek who is from a different city-state. So a foreigner is a person who is from outside of Greece who now lives in Greece. A Metic is a Greek person from a different city-state who now lives in your city-state. Right? Metics were not citizens of the new city-state in which they lived. So Metics, just like foreigners, just like slaves, did not have very many rights. Farmers did. Number 9, how did most Greeks deal with the problem of overpopulation? And then specifically, what did the Spartans do? So there are 3 things Greeks did to deal with the problem of overpopulation. Number 1, trade and commerce. So this is the main thing that Greek city-states did. They engaged in a lot of trade and commerce with other city-states and with traders from outside of Greece who could give them things that they needed, like maybe wood or wheat or whatever. The second thing that they would do is practice colonization. And then the third thing that Greeks did, and this is what the Spartans did, they relied on conquest. So they would forcibly take things from other city-states for themselves. Right? Why did the Spartans do this? Well, remember, the Spartans are in the middle of the peninsula. They're one of the few city-states that's not built along a coast. So they don't have easy access to the sea. So they had to rely on military power, on conquest, in order to get what they needed. And then, of course, because of that, the Spartans developed a very powerful army and a military culture. Number 10, according to legend, why did Agamemnon go to war against Troy? Remember, Agamemnon is the king of Mycenae. He went to war against Troy, according to legend, because he was deeply insulted at the kidnapping of Helen by Paris of Troy. So Paris of Troy, allegedly, according to the legend, quote-unquote, kidnapped Helen. Although, according to the story, Helen actually wanted to go with Paris. But anyways, Helen was a Spartan princess. Paris wanted her, so Paris kidnapped her. Agamemnon was really deeply offended that any Trojan would dare do this. And so he led a military campaign against Troy that turned into the Trojan War. How did Ulysses end the Trojan War? Remember, this is the story with the Trojan horse. So the Trojan War has been going on for about 10 years. Neither side is really making any progress. There's a lot of death, a lot of bloodshed. Everyone is miserable and suffering. Ulysses really wants to get home. He's tired of this war. He's never really wanted to fight in the war in the first place. So he comes up with a plan. He says that the Greeks are going to pretend they surrender to Troy, and they're going to put a bunch of their soldiers secretly inside of this gigantic wooden horse, and they're going to offer it to Troy as a trophy and a sign of their surrender. The Trojans are really happy to see this trophy because they know it means that the Greeks surrendered. So they bring the gigantic wooden horse trophy into the walls of the city. They have a big party that night, and people get really, really inebriated. That means they get drunk. And then, bam, the soldiers jump out of the Trojan horse in the middle of the night and they completely destroy the city. They burn it to the ground, basically, and kill many of the Trojans who live there. So that's how the Trojan War ends, with a trick. Number 11, what did the Greeks believe about their climate's impact on them? So remember, Greece's climate was very unique. A Mediterranean climate has hot, dry summers and mild winters with a decent amount of rainfall. Not a lot of rain, but a decent amount. So the Greeks believed that their climate, because it wasn't like scorching hot like ancient Mesopotamia would be, nor was it really cold like Western Europe would be or Northern Europe would be, they believed that their climate was sort of like in the middle of two extremes, and that this climate made them better than everyone else. It's kind of a weird thing to think, that the weather of the place you live in means you're better than everyone else, but that's what they believed. All right, that's it. The next video will be about what you need to know for the quiz on Monday.